I've shared a couple of different times in I'll use the word relationship, that I really enjoy cooking. In fact, in our household, I probably do about 90 to 95% of the cooking that takes place at home. It's just one of my favorite things to do. I love making meals for myself, for my family, and for anybody else who might be so inclined as to attempt my cooking. I love doing it. It's something that makes me happy. But I've cooked a lot of different things in a lot of different ways, but if I had to pick a certain type of dish that is actually my favorite to cook, I think, hands down, it's going to have to be, I love making soups and stews. Not now, obviously, because that'd be psychotic. It's so hot outside, but when the weather is so inclined to be conducive to that sort of thing, there's nothing in the world quite like sitting over a simmering pot that's going to make my family a hearty soup meal that's going to fill their bellies and hopefully warm their souls as well. I love doing that sort of thing. And over the years, I've kind of got a lot of different soups that I make on a consistent basis that my family loves to eat. My children request ad nauseum that I make my potato soup. They love that one in particular, probably because it has the least amount of vegetables. Mandy, every time it gets to being cold enough, she'll ask me, sometimes sheepishly, sometimes very demandingly, to please make her some chicken tortilla soup. That's her favorite one. And for me personally, I love my chili. I spent a long time working on my chili recipe. I ate a lot of bad chili to make what I consider to be amazing chili. But the thing about it is when it gets to being soup weather and that's all I want to fix and that sort of thing, at a certain point in time, you kind of get tired of the same soups over and over again. If I'm honest with you, I could probably make potato soup in my sleep. I think I did that once or twice, actually. I've made barrelfuls of chicken tortilla soup, and there are even some times where I get tired of my chili. Ooh, I feel bad having said that. I need a shower now. So when I reach that particular point in the season where I'm just kind of tired of making the same soups and stews over and over again, I'll do what I normally do. I go online and I look for new recipes. And on one occasion when I was doing so, I was scrolling through this list of different types of soups and stews, and I came across one that I'd never heard of before. It's called an Irish stew. I'd never heard of such a thing, but Mandy and I both tend to like a lot of Irish cuisines, and so I looked at what is in the soup to see if it might be something we'd be interested in. And it had all the same usual suspects that you expect. You got to have celery, you got to have carrots, you got to have potatoes, otherwise it's not a stew. But it also had things that Mandy and I both love to eat, but we don't eat very often, things like corned beef and cabbage. And I got kind of excited while I was looking at this because on paper this all looked like stuff that was just right up our alley. When Mandy got home that day, I showed her the same recipe, and I think she got a little bit more excited than I was at the time. But the thing about it is things like corned beef is a little bit more expensive than your usual soup ingredients. The thing about soup that I love most is that it's cheap. I like cheap. But we decided that this sounded so good to us that we wanted to go ahead and make it, but we were going to get our money's worth out of it. Again, I've talked about how I like to get my money's worth out of things. So we decided that the best way to do this, and how everything on this list was stuff that we enjoyed and loved, that we'd go ahead and make it not only for dinner one night, but we'd also make it for all of our lunches for that week. I was going to make a huge pot of Irish stew. I don't normally do that the first time I'm making something, but everything that was in this thing was stuff that we love. And so I knew that this was going to be a winner. So I decided on a Monday, because Mondays are usually my day off and I have plenty of time to do it, and this stew was going to take at least 3 hours to make, that was going to be the day. I went grocery shopping, I got all the stuff, I was so excited. I got all of it into the pot, and I noticed something right away as soon as everything got in the pot. It smelled amazing. Oh my goodness, this thing smelled so good. It was so hard to just not right away dip a ladle in and get myself out a hearty portion of this Irish stew. I couldn't wait. I was so excited. A couple hours later when Mandy got home, she parks in our one-car attached garage, and I could hear her from the kitchen because the door goes straight into there. I could hear her say, "Oh, that smells so good." Our mouths were watering. My taste buds were just so excited about the joy it was about to experience. Finally, after cooking for a very long period of time that day, it was finally ready for us to eat. And so I ladled it all out for our families. I gave my kids a slightly smaller portion because they were going to complain about it anyway because it wasn't chicken nuggets. But I made sure that Mandy and I both got just the heartiest of proportions. And as we're sitting there with that stew just wafting its deliciousness over us, oh, I couldn't wait. I think I prayed a little bit faster over that meal than normal. It's like, God bless the food, amen. And I got myself a bigger than average spoonful of this hearty, delicious thing. I unhinged my jaw to make room for all of it, and I shoved it in, and oh my goodness, it was the worst thing I've ever put in my mouth. It was awful. It was somehow sour and still savory, and it did not blend together in any way, shape, or form. And here's the thing, whenever I try a new recipe like this, I always make sure I follow it to a T, to make sure that I'm not messing it up. I'll add and do some stuff later on, but the first time I'm making sure my measurements are accurate, I'm putting in the right stuff. And I went back over that list, and yeah, I did everything the way the recipe described. And so I thought, well, maybe I accidentally bought some bad ingredients. So I looked at the expiration dates of everything that I had used, and yeah, it all checked out. It was all good. And all of this stuff that was in there was all stuff that I like. On paper, this was easily the best thing I could have made. And yet, when it mattered most, it was just awful. I can't express to you the level of disappointment I felt in that moment of this thing that I believed was going to be the end-all, be-all of meals that cost me quite a great deal of money, that didn't just ruin one meal, it ruined a lot of meals. Because again, I made enough for our lunches that week. It was so disheartening that this thing that I thought was going to be so perfect ended up just disappointing me. And it's tough for us when that sort of thing happens in our lives, right? That we invest in something, that we think this is going to be the way that we need to go, that this is the perfect path for us to take, and we usually find out just a little too late that it's not what we thought it was. That level of disappointment can't be matched, I think, in our lives. To have this belief that this is going to be amazing, this is going to be incredible, and just to be left to know it's just not. I think on some level, Samuel probably felt that in our text today. We're going to be a little all over the map, and unfortunately, I ran out of time and did not get the Bible verse slides up on the screen, so if you want to follow along, you're actually going to have to get a Bible open. Sorry about that. But we're going to be in 1 Samuel chapter 8. We're going to start there, but you got to be ready to move. We're covering a lot of ground. To be honest with you, when I was thinking out this sermon series, this was originally 2 sermons. Now it's 1. So we're going to need to move today. But let me give you a little, just kind of a really quick, just to catch up. Last week we had this amazing moment that took place for the nation of Israel. They had strayed from God. They recognized that, hey, we're not where we need to be. And they have this moment on top of this mountain where they are with Samuel, and they get everything right with God, and God shows up in a big way immediately. As soon as the Israelites turn back to God, God is right there with them. It was wonderful, it was amazing, it was incredible. And then the text kind of takes a weird turn, though, because when we start in 1 Samuel 8, in verse 1, the first 4 words, we can make some assumptions based on them. And those first 4 words are, when Samuel grew old. What does this sort of thing imply? It implies that a lot of time has passed already. Right, from where we last left things off, where Samuel was not a young man anymore, but he wasn't old by any stretch of the imagination. Now we're kind of jumping ahead in time. Why would we do something like that? Well, because that means that things have been so quiet and peaceful for so long that there wasn't anything worth writing down. Can you imagine what that would be like? To have a stretch of time in your life where things are so quiet and peaceful that nobody thinks we should write this down? I'm 37. It hadn't happened yet. In my lifetime, I've had things like Columbine, 9/11, 2 recessions, a couple wars, now a global pandemic. That's just the headlines. I'd really like just a period of time where I can say, then Brandon grew old. That'd be fantastic. But that means that since this particular moment on this mountaintop with God, things have been so great under the leadership of Samuel. Because again, Samuel's not just a priest, Samuel is the judge. And things in Israel kind of work a little differently than what we're accustomed to, because you heard me mention a couple of weeks ago that Israel was what's called a theocracy. It means their system of government was based around, instead of a king, instead of a president, instead of any of that stuff, that their king, their ruler was God. And for generations, God has functioned in such a way that he appoints judges to kind of be the voice of God for that generation. And they would come and they would tell people what it is that God wants to do. God would oftentimes speak directly to these judges. And for a while, this system of government is working. It's had its ups, it's had its downs, but every system of government does. But it's been working for them. But now Samuel has grown old. And the rest of verse 1 tells us, it says, he appointed his sons as judges over Israel. Again, this kind of makes sense because we talked about this a few weeks ago, that oftentimes in this particular culture, if your father was a priest, then you were going to be a priest. If your father is a judge, you're going to be a judge. If your father is a fisherman, you're going to be a fisherman, on and on and on. That fathers, their role and responsibility was to teach their children how to take over for them. That was the expectation. And so Samuel, it kind of makes sense that as he's getting older, he's decided it's time for my sons to kind of share some of this workload. Samuel's an old man, and at some point in time, you just can't do it all on your own. So he appoints his sons to come and help him, but this is not really a great thing. Maybe it's the optimist in me, but I like to believe that Samuel has tried his best to be a great dad. That he's done everything that he can throughout their lives to pour into his sons, to teach them what it means to be men after God's own heart. But now that they got a little power, now that they've got a little responsibility, they show that they don't have the same integrity as their father. Verse 3 says, however, his sons did not walk in his ways. They turned towards dishonest profit, they took bribes, and they perverted justice. And so the leaders, the elders of Israel, the older guys who are kind of overseeing the different tribes of Israel, they come up with a solution, and they present this idea to Samuel. They kind of tell him, hey, your sons aren't really doing this great a job. And then in verse 5 it says, they said, look, you're old. That's a great way to start off a conversation with somebody, right? Look, you're old, all right? I'm pretty sure some of you in this room would throw things at me if I started off a conversation with you that way. Hi, Mom. Mandy's birthday's coming up really soon, and it always fills me with joy because she's about 9 months older than me, so I have fun with that. Anyway, but they said, look, you're old, and your sons do not walk in your ways. Therefore, appoint a king to judge over us, the same as all the other nations have. A couple things here that kind of stand out to me. A couple things that I think are worth pointing out here. First off, I got to question their motivation for asking for a king. Right? This is like peer pressure on a nationwide level. Well, we want a king. Why do you want a king? They get to have a king. Why can't we have a king? But if we look a little bit below the surface on that, it kind of makes sense to me, doesn't it? All these other nations, they've got a figurehead. They've got a person that is kind of the face of their country, somebody that they can point to and say, this is our guy. And for Israel, while it's been great having God as their leader, they don't have anybody that they can come to directly. Because the judge is the one who usually speaks through, or God speaks through that judge. They've not had somebody that they can come to and really say these sorts of things. There's only one guy, and maybe one guy every generation who gets to actually hear from God. They don't have that physical presence of a figurehead. Somebody that they can point to and say, that's the guy. So on some level, I kind of understand why they want this sort of thing, right? Because physical leadership is always better than no leadership, right? So that kind of makes sense, but there's also this other side to it that I don't think we really take into account when they ask this sort of thing, and that's who they're asking it to. Understand, Samuel has spent pretty much his adult life as that judge, as that representative of God, if we want to go ahead and use this word, as that figurehead. And so if you're Samuel and these guys who you have spent your entire life pouring into, leading, doing everything that you can to help keep them on the right path. And now they're coming to you and they say, we want somebody else. How do you not take that personally? How does Samuel not look at this as a rejection of himself? But here's this thing. God has this really great way of keeping things in perspective. And he challenges Samuel to do the same. He says in verse 8, it says, "But the Lord said to him, listen to the people and everything they say to you." This has got to be huge, and this has got to be a big moment for Samuel in my mind. "They have not rejected you. They have rejected me as their king." Ooh. That's heavy. To think that this entire nation that for generations has been a theocracy, that has been where God has reigned over them. And God is saying, they ain't rejecting you, Samuel. They're rejecting me. Because that's always worked out well for them in the past, right? Samuel warns all of Israel of what it actually means to have a king. And again, in our culture, in our context, this is something that we don't really understand. We have an idea of it, but in a monarchy, when there's one figurehead, that one guy has all the power. And so he warns them that this person could be somebody who comes in and does whatever he wants. And if you got a field, he could take that field from you, and you can't do anything about it. He could be very selfish, he could be very self-centered, and focused in on what he wants to take care of his. That he can make laws that are going to be a burden for you to have to deal with. And yet still, even though Samuel is giving him all these warnings, still, they ask for a king. Which, in my mind at least, it raises a really interesting question. If you never had a king before, and now you want a king, who gets to be king? How do you determine that? Like, you don't want to vote, right? Because, that kind of defeats the whole purpose of a monarchy if you vote your king in. So who gets to be king? Well, enter a man by the name of Saul. And when we first see Saul, that's a fun phrase. When we first encounter Saul, that's a better way to put it, we are told something that's really interesting right off the bat. Something that really kind of stands out in 1 Samuel chapter 2, 1 Samuel chapter 9, verse 2. There we go. It says, "He had a son named Saul, an impressive young man. There was no one more impressive among the Israelites than he. He stood a head taller than everyone else." It's interesting to me that the author of 1 Samuel would use the phrase impressive twice in his description of Saul here. There's something about Saul and his character that just stands out, that separates him from everybody else. And sure, yeah, he points to his height, and as somebody who's a little on the taller side, we do tend to stand out in a crowd. But there's more to it than that there's something in Samuel's character. There's something about him as a person that just, this guy makes sense. He's got all these different great characteristics, and as we go on a little bit further, we learn all sorts of different things about him. We learn that he's a creative problem solver. We learn that he is smart. We learn that he is cunning. We learn that he's just somebody that people like to follow. That when he's in the room, not just based on his height, but he kind of commands everyone's attention. That this guy has to be the guy. And in fact, when Samuel first meets him, and again, Samuel's got to be coming into this whole thing still feeling a little bit of that rejection. God told him don't feel that way, but again, how do you not? If you've been doing this job your entire life and somebody says we want somebody to do it better, it's got to be hard for him. And yet there's something when Samuel encounters Saul that maybe just a little bit shifts Samuel's mind. We see it in chapter 9, verse 17. It says, "When Samuel saw Saul, the Lord told him, 'Here is the man I told you about. He will govern his people.'" God himself is telling Samuel, this is the guy. This is the one I've picked out. And so when Samuel knows that this guy's already impressive, that he's a foot taller than everybody else, and that God himself has said this is the guy, how can Samuel not be on board, right? Samuel's maybe shifting his way here. He's coming around to this whole new idea of a king. Samuel himself is at this point where this is probably a good idea. It's probably, again, that initial hurt when the people asked for a king, but now he's seen Saul. Now he's encountered him. He's gotten to know him a little bit. He's learned a little bit of his characteristics. He's seen a lot of great things. He sees so much in Saul that he knows that Saul doesn't just have the potential to be a okay king. Saul doesn't have the potential to just be a good king. Saul has all the characteristics and all the potential in the world to be a great king. And so Samuel comes around to this whole idea, and he presents Saul to the entire nation of Israel. In 1 Samuel chapter 10, verse 24, Samuel points to Saul being the right man for the job. It says, Samuel said to all the people, "Do you see the one the Lord has chosen?" I love this phrase. There is no one like him among the entire population. And all the people shouted, "Long live the king." Sorry, the voice just naturally goes lower for that kind of phrase because I feel like it needs to. It's more dramatic. Samuel is 100% on board. He's met Saul, he's seen all the characteristics, he's learned enough about him to say, there ain't anybody in this whole nation like him. And so Samuel is 100% on board. Everything about Saul's characteristics have proven to Samuel, this is the right guy. This is the one that we need. This is something that's going to be fantastic for our entire country. And for sure, there are some in Israel who aren't on board, probably because they were hoping that they would get to be king, because again, how do you pick a king? I think it should be by who has the best beard. But they have they have a handful of people who are just not completely convinced in chapter 10. But then in chapter 11, we see Saul having to lead the nation of Israel into his first ever battle. Almost right away, Saul is going to have a litmus test as to how good of a leader is he actually going to be. So Saul goes and he recruits all kinds of different guys, getting them together to go into this battle against the Ammonites, not the Philistines, not yet. The Ammonites. This is one of those few times where you get a whole other bad guy. It's fun, right? So he gets these guys ready for this battle, and this battle goes pretty well. In fact, verse 11 in chapter 11 gives us an idea of just how great it goes. It says, the next day Saul organized the troops into 3 divisions. During the morning watch, they invaded the Ammonite camp, and they slaughtered them until the heat of the day. There were survivors, but they were so scattered that no 2 of them were left together. It's pretty good. It's not bad. Just came in, had this whole Ammonite army coming up against him, and he just destroyed them to the point that what handful of survivors there were couldn't even leave together. This is about as great as a first impression of being a king can possibly go for somebody. And so naturally, after this particular moment, all of those guys who were still on the sidelines saying, I don't know about this guy, now they're all on board. Because Saul has demonstrated that he has the characteristics to not be an okay king, to not be a good king, but to be a great king. And so everybody is behind him. Everybody is so excited about this. And in fact, Saul has proven to be such a good king that Samuel thinks, kid's got this. And he actually decides to retire on some level. Understand, Samuel's still the priest. That's not a position that you can just give up. It's not a position you retire from. It's something that he's still going to have to continue to do. And he says very openly, I'm going to continue to do my responsibilities as your priest, but as your judge, as your figurehead, as somebody who's going to lead you into the next generation, Saul has this. But I find it interesting that the last thing that Samuel says, in his last public speech, the last thing that he says serves as a bit of a warning. We see it in chapter 12, verse 25. I told you, we're going to be flying around all over the place. In fact, I kind of recommend that maybe later today, go home and read over these chapters so you get a better appreciation of what really goes on here. But in chapter 12, verse 25, Samuel gives this last warning. He says, however, if you continue to do what is evil, both you and your king will be swept away. I don't know if Samuel knew just how on the nose that little warning was about to be. Understand, this is his last address to the entire nation, and the last thing that he says is a warning about not just their actions, but also their king himself. And when we turn the page over to chapter 13, we see something that maybe indicates to us that Saul, while he had all these great characteristics, while he looked great on paper, maybe he ain't the guy. See, it's not too long after this that the Israelites find themselves heading into battle again, this time with the Philistines. This is kind of like if you go to a Batman movie and you know the bad guy's going to be the Joker. At a certain point, you're just kind of tired of it, right? Like, I love the Joker, but can we mix it up a little? Nobody else? Cool. You all know how nerdy I am. It's fine. But they're getting ready to go back into battle with the Philistines. And give them props here because they've kind of learned from the past. They know that before we go into this battle, we probably ought to have a sacrifice. We probably ought to go ahead and get God on our side. Again, like we talked about last week, they didn't do that. Things didn't go well. It went real bad. So now they've kind of learned from that mistake. God bless them, they're trying. And so they send word to Samuel saying, hey, we're ready to have this sacrifice. When can you get here? And Samuel sends word back, I'll be there in a week. That's a long time to wait, right? You ever had to wait a week for something anymore? If Amazon doesn't have it in 2 days, I'm not buying it. But Samuel says, I'll be there in a week. I'll be here at this time. And he gets word to Saul. And so Saul is standing on this mountainside waiting with his troops. They're kind of hidden so they can protect themselves a little bit from the Philistines. They're in different caves. They're hiding behind big rocks. Somebody threw a blanket over himself because he thought that would work. Okay. But they're doing everything they can, but they're forced to kind of watch. As over the course of 7 days, the Philistine army keeps growing. It keeps getting bigger. It keeps getting more imposing. In fact, in chapter 13, where am I at? In verse 5, it actually says that the Philistines had troops as numerous as the sands on the seashore. That's a lot of guys. And if you're sitting on this mountainside for a week watching this army do nothing but grow, at a certain point, that little rah-rah speech you gave ahead of time of, we got this, guys, that's starting to wear off. Because they got a lot of dudes. And some of the Israelite men, they start getting a little nervous. And Saul, as the king, he wakes up one day and he realizes, hey, weren't there more guys? Didn't we have more guys in this battle? Because a lot of the Israelites have turned tail and left. And we still ain't at day 7 yet. So it's pressing on Saul as the king to kind of get this moving, to kind of get things rolling, because if we continue to wait, they're just going to get bigger. The threat is going to be more looming the longer that we wait for Samuel. And finally, Saul is able to be patient long enough to wait for day number 7. And on day number 7, he's ready at that time, and Samuel's not there. Now let's give Samuel a little bit of grace here, all right? We started off this whole sermon by saying Samuel grew old. Maybe he's just not getting around as fast as he used to. I'm sure none of you know what that's like, but Samuel's running behind, and so Saul gets it in his brain. He says, we got to come up with something, we got to do something, and we got to do it now. And so in chapter 13, verse 9, it says, so Saul said, bring me the burnt offering and the fellowship offering. And he offered the burnt offering. Maybe it's the practicality of my brain, but on the surface level at least, this kind of makes a little bit of sense to me, doesn't it? Right? For a week now, you've been waiting on this guy to come and to do this one thing. And once that one thing is over, you can go down there, you can have God on your side, and you can go end this whole war. But now the guy isn't here. But something we need to understand, and this is kind of a hard thing, I think, for us to wrap our minds around, because again, it's a different culture, it's a different context, a different time. But all the way back to Moses, when the law was first being written down, when the law of God was being written as this new nation was being born, it was always the responsibility of the priest to be the one to offer the sacrifice, not the king. Saul has overstepped his bounds. Saul has done something that he was not meant to do. Saul has just shown a lack of respect for the law. A king who does not respect the law is a problem. No sooner than Saul actually finishes the sacrifice that Samuel finally makes his way there, because of course, right? I mean, been waiting on him this long, you finally stopped waiting on him, and now he shows up. And Samuel sees what's just happened. He understands the ramifications, the weight of what Saul has just done. That Saul has completely disrespected the law of God, the law that has been in place for generations, the law that was meant to be there for a reason. And Samuel asks him very simply, almost in the way of a disappointed parent in verse 11, he says, "What have you done?" On paper, on the surface level, everything about Saul has shown that he had all the characteristics to not be an okay king, to not be a good king, but to be a great king. But in this moment where he has shown a lack of respect for the law of God, he has just shown that right now, when it matters most, that he is not going to be a great king. Because he has just shown a complete and utter lack of respect. Again, imagine where Samuel's at. He wasn't on board with this whole new king thing idea. He meets Saul and he changes his mind. This is the guy. This is the one. He tells all of Israel, this is the king. This is a good decision. This is the one. We're going to make this work. Only to see Saul break the law. To disrespect the law that God himself laid out for the nation of Israel. To thumb his nose at the authority of God. And now he knows Saul is not what he thought he would be. Saul is not going to live up to the hope that Samuel had placed in him. Imagine how gutted Samuel is in this moment, because it is such a painful realization for each and every one of us when we come to the moment that we realize this thing that we thought was going to be it, this thing that we've been chasing after, this thing that we have been pursuing, this thing that we thought was going to be the thing, when it's proven to not be it, it can devastate us. It can destroy us, right? Because we've invested time and effort and energy and money and whatever else into this thing because we believed so wholeheartedly, because everything on the surface of it said, this is the thing, only to find out that it's not. We chase after so many different things in our lives that oftentimes we find out far too late, usually when it matters most, that it wasn't what we thought it would be. I don't know what that is for you. Maybe it's a promotion at work. You're chasing after it. You've spent all your time for it, and then finally the day comes, your boss says, you got it. And then you find out it isn't the best thing for you. It tears everything down. It separates you even more from your family. The raise isn't going as far as you thought it was going to. And it ain't the thing. Maybe it's a certain relationship in your life that you chase so hard for. That you thought that this is the person. This is the one. Only to find out, usually too late, that they weren't who you thought they were. Folks, we have to be so cautious about the things that we choose to chase after in our lives. We have to be so careful to make sure that we are chasing after the things that are actually going to matter. And if there's one thing that Saul himself should have been chasing after, if there's one thing that all of Israel should have been chasing after, the one thing that would matter was God himself. If we want to find fulfillment, if we want to chase after something that won't let us down, the only thing that we can do is chase after the will of God in our lives. It's hard. Right? Because we always ask the same questions. How do we know what the will of God is in our life? How do we know we're doing the right thing? How do we know that this is what God wants? But understand, if we're chasing after it, God is going to reveal it to us. If we're pursuing after God, God will reveal himself to us. Yes, he's going to push us past our comfort zone. Yes, he's going to ask us to do things that we may not be super comfortable with. Yes, it's going to be difficult. But if we want to find that true fulfillment, if we want to find the thing that is going to truly enrich our lives in the way that we thought all these other things that we chased after were going to, it comes when we seek after him. I wish Saul would have known that. Samuel, I'm sure, wishes that Saul would have known that. Because everything about Saul on paper said he was the thing. And when it mattered most, he proved he wasn't. Jesus told us what it is that we're meant to be chasing after, the only truly worthy thing of chasing, in Matthew 6, verse 33, and we'll close with it. He said, "Seek first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and all these things will be provided for you."